Hello, I'm Sharon Gray. Today I'm going to teach you how to paint something with really intricate lines when you want a lot of precision. So we're going to paint this beautiful dancer in front of a window. Now notice that the color is pretty low key, but the light and the lines are absolutely spectacular. So I want to maintain every single detail that I possibly can from this reference material. And for that reason, we're going to make a grid. Making a grid is the way that you can scale your reference material to any size that you want to work from. So I could make this painting as big as a house if I wanted to. All I need is a means of measuring accurately. So start by measuring the length and the width of your paper, your reference paper I should say. So this has a length of 7.5 and a width of 5.5. Then I go to my watercolor paper, and yes, I did cheat to save some time. I did this before, but I wanted to figure out how long I could make it since the length is the only thing in question. I know that I have plenty of room on the paper for any width that I would choose. So since the length is longer in this case, start there. And I measured and found that I could make 10 inches long. So I go back to my reference photo, and using some blank space at the bottom, I set up the ratio of length to width from reference material to what I know about the finished painting. So 7.5 to 5.5 is the first length to width measurement. This is the reference material. Set that equal to 10 because I know that that's the length of my finished painting, but X because I don't know what the width is going to be. So this is how we need to find X. For some of you, this is going to be really simple, and for others, it might not be. So follow along as best you can, and of course you can always rewind the tape if you need to. Now it's important that you keep the length over the width. So length, length, width, width, unknown width in this case. Then you're going to cross multiply. So 5 times 5.10 is 55. And it's still going to be equal to 7.5 times x, or 7.5x. Then to get the x by itself, you just divide out the 7.5 on both sides. So 7.5 divided by 7.5 is going to cancel out to be 1, or just you're going to be left with that x. And 55 divided by 7.5 is 7.33 repeating. So I know that my unknown length for my finished painting needs to be 7.33. So then I go back to my stretched paper and I mark down my 7.33 and I make myself a box, which is what you see before you. And this box is exact proportions to the original reference material, which is spectacular. Next, I'm going to protect the borders and cover my staples so that the wet paper doesn't continually tear as it dries. You get it wet and it dries and it might tear a little bit because it sort of re-stretches itself. I also like to have a white frame around my work when it's done to see how it's going to look framed a little bit better. So I'm going to use masking tape and do that really quickly. Just keep it right up against those pencil marks. Now this step is not necessary, strictly speaking. It's my own personal preference, and if you don't stretch your paper with staples, you might find that you don't need to do this at all. However, if you're working on rag paper, you need to either stretch it and staple it onto a board like this, or you need to use watercolor block, which is all stretched for you, and it doesn't need to be re-stretched because it's attached one sheet on top of another in a big block of paper. So it's essentially a board made of solid paper, and then when you're finished with a piece, you use a palette knife or a butter knife and cut that off the board or the block. I just prefer the texture of the Arches 140-pound cold pressed paper, so that is exclusively what I work on, and that's what this is. You can just buy it in a big sheet and cut it down to size. It's really nice to work with, and it holds the color and takes abuse, if you want to call it that, whenever you need to smudge out mistakes or anything like that. It does that really well. So now I have the proportions, but I need to make my grid. So this is another cause for measuring. I always start by finding the center point of my length. If it is here at 7.5, you can figure out that the center is going to be 3.75 and mark that down top and bottom. However, it can get a little bit dicey with making precise measurements, especially when you're talking about 7.33, and like, who on earth knows the exact center of 7.33? And even if you calculated it, can you find it on your ruler? Maybe you can, but for me and the rest of lazy civilization, I prefer to use a strip of paper. So I just use a piece of paper that has at least one mechanically straight edge, and I put it against my length, and I mark down the end of the length so that I can then go and fold it exactly in half against that length. Fold, fold. Then open it up and fold the half in half. Fold, fold. Then open it up and I fold it again. So now I've folded the quarter in half. Open it up, and then you see I have these nice clear fold marks, and using those I can mark down the length and width. I can mark down little increments. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of them. So I'm going to do that top and bottom, and it is very important that you do every side. So I'll just do the top the same way. If you have used the fold method, then you're going to need to make sure that that's pulled really nice and tight. Otherwise, your paper will bunch up and you won't have that great accuracy anymore. And you need your graph to be absolutely accurate as you can possibly get it. Especially if you're making your reference material into a larger painting, because then those little inaccuracies are really going to show up in your drawing. I'm going to do the same thing for the width. So here's a new piece of paper. I will fold it in half. Fold that half in half. And I will do the same thing on the side and the side here. And then I'm going to mark those same exact points on this piece of paper. And as you probably guessed, you're going to need a new strip of paper to do it because it's a different length. So just make sure that you have the same marks that you can translate from drawing to your watercolor paper. Then, once you have them, you can label them. So A, B, C, D, and so on. And then I use the sides 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then I have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I on the top as well. And I'll have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I on the top. And my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 down each side on my watercolor painting. Let me set up that grid really quickly and then I'll come back and show you how to use it. Now you can see better what I mean about having the corresponding grid with the reference material and your drawing paper. So then, the way that you use it is probably exactly what you imagined. You find key points. I like to start with the large shapes, especially the ones that are easy to find. So for instance, this line of the floor lines up almost perfectly with the 6 mark. So I'll go to the 6 on my reference material, and since it's a floor, you could expect it to be mechanically straight, so I'll put that in with the ruler. Same thing goes for the window. Of course, she's in front of the window down here, so I want to make sure my lines don't get too dark. But right between G, but halfway between G and H, and almost just a little after the C, we see that window. So I'll make some marks first, G and H, and then the bottom, the light portion of the window, I use my ruler to find exactly where that lines up. You see it's about a quarter after the 4. So going to my reference material again, I guess the window to be about here. I like to do this with a triangle because then your lines are not only straight, they're square. So they have 90-degree angles, just as you want them to. And I'll have to go in and I'll do the detail work on the window once I have the large shapes in place. So I'm not going to spend all my time putting in all of these lines until I have the dancer put down. She's the most difficult part of it, of course, because she's the most complex. She's not just a rectangle. And her arms and fingers have to be very graceful, the line of her neck, everything on the body has to be just so. And that's another reason why I like to use the grid system for this, because then I'm in a really good position to take a measurement of the angle of her leg, for instance. See how this diagonal cuts right at the top of her thigh, and then I can mark where it bisects my grid. So it goes right through the D and the same exact line that bisects the window right here halfway between G and H. So I go through D and then G and H. And I know that that line of the thigh is going to be somewhere in that area. I want to show, I want to find the large shapes of her head and waist and torso and all of that as well. So I'm going to find marks for the top of the head, right here, halfway between 1 and 2. And then the center point, you see the center of the head lines up almost at the F. So about here, and then halfway between 1 and 2. And putting down things like the girl are more complicated because they're not just simple straight lines. So what I'm going to do is not grid everything. I'm going to use the grid to mark down some key points, like the top of the head. Did you notice how I just put that down with a dot? Don't try to put curves down with a grid, just get some guidelines for where things should fall. And if it's imprecise, try to find something else. So I was going to try to find the marks for the line of the cheek, but they're kind of iffy. So I'm going to go for the bottom of the chin instead. The bottom of the chin is going to fall at about 2 1/3. And it should be in line with the F mark. 2 1/3. In line with F, putting it right here. So once I have the dot for the mark for the bottom of the chin and the top of the head, then I might want to just sketch in the feel of the head from there. And I don't have to use a ruler to use my grid, so I can constantly look back and forth, and get some estimates for where things should be too. But the more complex your picture is, the more guide points you should give yourself. So let's do this window pane. This top window pane is almost on the 2, just a little below the 2. But I like to get that in there because that window pane is going to help me to place her shoulders and face. Because you see, I can put other things on her in terms of the negative space that I see between these features and this window pane. So you see how these white shapes around her body are formed in the white glass of this window? If I have the panes of glass down, they can help me to, I can look at the negative shapes to more accurately put her in as well. So I'll put in this second window pane, a little under the 3. And those need to be kept really, really square and straight to one another. It's going to be very noticeable if they aren't exactly straight. So take your time on that. Then I'll be having some cross pieces about there at the E and a little after the F. And about here on the D. And then this window pane ends about here on the C point. So did you see how I sketched those out with little notches, and then I can quickly go in and straighten them with my square. Such a little time-saving device. Now, the drawing portion of your painting is very, very, very important, especially if you want realism. This is the only area in your whole painting process where it's going to be relatively easy to fix mistakes, and where you have some control over the way your finished lines are going to look. So my recommendation is to spend a long time on your drawing, and also to let it rest after you think that it's all right. Let it rest, give yourself a break from it, come back with fresh eyes a few times so that you can really, really catch any mistakes before they've gone too far, and certainly before you start to paint. It's much, much easier to catch the mistakes in the drawing phase than it is at any other time, just to say again. See, but now I can go and using these panes, since I used my grid to put the panes in the window in the first place, it's like I'm using another grid system right on my system, right on the drawing itself, because her skirt should end at about the place where this window pane ends, right here after the G. So let me put that window pane in. I might need to move this. Nope, that should be right. If I put that pane in, then I should be able to sketch in her skirt. And now I can look at the negative space of the windows to sketch her in a little bit more accurately. So this process is the most time consuming. And since this is a watercolor painting tutorial and not a drawing class, I'm going to do the rest of this work off camera now that I've shown you how to use your grid, and you can understand why it's so important that you lay it out very, very accurately. So I will see you in probably about an hour and a half of drawing time. And then we'll catch up again and start the painting. Now I am satisfied with my drawing, and it did actually take me more than an hour and a half. So if you find that this is a really frustrating one for you and it's very difficult to get the features right, you're not alone. It's a toughie. So now the drawing is done, but I need to protect some of these highlights on her body because they're really important to telling the story. So I'm going to go and protect those with my masking fluid pen. I'm looking for the highlights on the edges of her hands and legs and in the hair. Like up here. Don't overdo it. But I do like the added confidence that I get when I know that my really important highlights are protected for me. So that no matter what happens, I can't lose them. On the nose a little bit, on the edge of the face. Here is a really important one that carves out the neck and shoulder. And it's just streaming all over, hitting the back of the neck, the back of this shoulder on the right too. And it really accentuates the muscles and helps you tell, helps the story of the way that the body is moving. So getting the highlights in the right place is very important. So I'm just going to work carefully like this. And then I think I'm going to protect in the windowsill, just the bottom line here. Otherwise, it's going to be really easy for me to just avoid the whites. I'm not going to protect those windows. I would if my technique for painting around the windows was going to call for a lot of spattering or a lot of, putting a lot of paint on the board. But since this is going to be pretty slow and controlled, I don't need to do as much masking. Then I'm just going to let this masking fluid dry, and we'll come back in just a few minutes and start painting. Okay, we can start painting this now, but there's one more thing I want to do. I'm going to start by painting the upper background, and so I want to protect those straight white lines with some tape. Straight white lines of the window, for instance. This is still masking tape, it's just more narrow. I put it down and then I really press with my fingernail. Otherwise the water and the paint will seep through and ruin that line. Having a beautiful, perfect line in your painting is really, really powerful for your composition. But it is always going to draw the eye. Anything precise, like a perfectly straight line, it's going to draw the eye. And if there's any kind of flaw, the eye will see it immediately. So if you want it to be a very, very straight line, tape it. I'm going to tape the floor as well. The wall that she's painting in front of is so highly textured that it doesn't look perfectly straight. But it is, so we're going to keep it perfectly straight. And then I know that this line that I masked is going to look really weird next to these other taped lines. So I need to tape all of them. And watch for edges like this where there's a little bit hanging off. Anything that's going to disrupt the flow of the watercolor paint. It's going to leave a little pattern there, and you don't want that protected. Okay, now, this is a really kind of interesting, neutral, spongy looking wall. So let's mix up a color, kind of a brown purple. It's pretty good, but I want more purple. That looks better. When it dries, it's going to look even better still. And then I'm just going to lay it down because I don't want it, I'm not going to wet the background because I don't want the color to fade too much. Also, it's a dappled texture, so I think I'm going to get closer to that by working with a dry brush technique, because every time I lift up my brush, it leaves a little dapple. Now work very carefully around your dancer. Those lights are protected, but they're still very shallow little lines. I could have masked her off completely, but I decided not to because I knew that I'd be using this slow, deliberate dry brush technique in the background. So I don't really have to have a very, very smooth background. But I do want to keep that sense of the darkness being down here so that it really, really contrasts nicely with the back, with the light streaming out right here. So I'm going to add some more darks on top. And then I'll use my damp sponge and I'll just soften those out a bit like this. I don't want this texture to look too sponged. Everyone knows what a sponge looks like. And the wall doesn't look exactly sponged. Very, very few things do. So the trick is that you want to use a different tool to give you a more natural feel, because you can't paint everything with a brush, but you never want your painting to immediately, you never want people to be able to look at your painting and immediately know how you did it. Oh, that's a Saul technique. Oh, you used a sponge. Yup. Because then they're seeing the technique and not your painting. Now very carefully I carve out her leg with this background color. As often as I can, I paint my backgrounds first, because that is the way things happen in real life as well. You're not painted, the background isn't painted around you. The background exists and then you are on top of it. So I try to paint things in the same order that they naturally would exist. And a good rule of thumb is too that you paint back to front. So background, if you're painting a landscape scene, that's going to be like the sky first, then the mountains on top of the sky, and you layer things like that, so that the foreground elements are the very last things that you paint. I like that this is developing an interesting texture. Now I want to go into it with a bit more color variation. Here's more like an ochre. So this is yellow ochre on my palette. That doesn't mean that it's going to look very different to you watching me on the screen. Also make sure that whenever you paint something in one place, you paint it in another or two more places so it doesn't look like a mistake. Like if there was only red one spot It would look very unusual. It would look like a mistake. I introduced ochre over here, so I need to introduce ochre over here as well. And while I've got it taped, I really want to take advantage of that and darken up any of those corners and lines that I see. So the corners and next to the wall and next to the floor in this painting are very, very dark. Do that darkening while you have your edges protected. And now I'm just kind of playing with some different brush strokes to see what I like. If you pick it up or you dapple it like you're stippling, or you sort of slice it across, what looks effective for the area? What are you trying to achieve? Ask yourself these questions. As you reach max capacity on your paper too, you're going to see a difference in the way the technique holds on the paper. So here my color is getting really saturated and I can't put more color down. So I start to just see it float around on the surface right here. And then every time it dries, it goes white again in the middle. See how that's happening right here? It's not good or bad, it's just a fact. So be aware of it, use it to your advantage. Go back with the sponge. I like to use the sponge to soften out any texture lines that I don't quite like, so I can make some adjustments without using my brush all the time. And using a variety of techniques gives you the same kind of depth that using a variety of colors and letting them mix on the page does. So it's definitely something that you want to do. Don't paint everything with your brush. Excellent. I'm going to let this dry. Okay, the back here is painted, so I'm going to peel off my tape and look at that. I have a really nice clean line that I could never have gotten otherwise, so thank you, tape. I have one little flaw right here, but I can patch that up easily enough. To be really careful though, I'll just take one of those pieces of tape that I already took off and I'll put it down again. I still have that color on my palette, so it's not much of a trick to just go back in and patch it up. And this technique with the dry brush is really lends itself well to patching up. There, boom, done. Okay, now we have the wall done. Let's do the floor. So I'm going to peel up the tape, and then I'm going to waste all of my effort if I don't retape that again. Now this is tricky. You have to be extremely precise. So put it down carefully, 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 right against the line that you just protected. And then tamp it down really well once again. You don't want to damage the paper in this step, but you do need to use your fingernail and run it against that tape. Excellent. Then I'm going to quickly protect the feet. Just cover them with some masking fluid. And I know that it might seem excessively fussy, like tape it, masking fluid this, more tape, peel it off, do it again. But this is the only way that you can get nice uninterrupted background color, because you're not going around anything. You can go right over the top. And it's the only way that you can get those really, really precise, realistic lines. You have to protect them. You can't do that really any other way. I've tried using a ruler. I've tried drawing the lines and just very, very carefully painting them. To a certain degree, those techniques can work, but honestly, you save time and you make a more polished look in the end if you just start with the masking fluid. But you have to be careful. You have to know the limitations of the masking fluid and the tape. If you want extremely stark lines, that's when you use mask. If you don't want your lines to lift up and be extremely stark though, you need to use a different technique, like water masking or blotting or other things that we'll explore in different videos. But in this case, I want her feet to remain really, really distinct from the floor, and that's why I'm choosing to use the masking fluid. I need to wait just a couple of minutes for that to dry, and then I'll come back. All right, the stage is set, and now we can paint the stage. Wahaha. So let's start by trying to match something like this. These are really dull colors. They're too dull. Let's add a little bit of pink, a little warmth to it. So this is another reason why I love to be an artist. I can improve on what I see. That's perfect. Again though, see how it has this rough texture, lots of kind of lines going through. We're going to do a better job of capturing that with a dry brush technique. So when you see a lot of texture, something rough, use dry brush technique. Unless it's smooth and flowy, you almost always want to use a dry brush. So the brush itself, as you notice, is wet, but the paper is dry. So this is kind of a mix. But I'm going to start in the dark. Oh, see, it's a little too wet, it's too flowy. I'm going to add a little bit more pigment and not re-wet my brush. And then I'm just going to scumble. That means run the brush across and let it skip over that dry paper so that it picks up a bit of the texture. And what I'm looking for as I do this, I'm squinting at my reference material and I am getting a sense for not the color so much as the pattern of light and dark. The power of this piece comes from the window, the really, really high light. I have to keep that light at all costs. So I can't be just scrubbing across here, otherwise the light won't look like it's falling on the floor and the whole thing will be ruined. That effect at least, that'll be gone. So I'm going to go in with some rosy colors and some darks, but I'm going to keep them to the sides because, of course, I want the light to shine across the floor. So what about this part in the middle where I want it to, I can't just stop. That doesn't look like a floor. So now I'm getting my brush clean and I'm going to cut through to get some of these line effects, and I'm going to blend out the edge so that you can't really see a determinate or a definite stopping point. So I do get some color, but it's very, very, very light. And now I'm going to spritz and soften everything up a little bit faster. I can even try to scrub some of those lines away with the sponge. So what I have is a tool chest in my head of the way that different textures react with watercolor and the way things generally look, but I don't know how they're going to look for any particular piece. So I kind of just go back and forth trying one thing or another, and that's based on experience, years of experience, but it's not as though I know exactly what's going to happen. That's part of the beauty of watercolor. It's part of the fear too. So when you're just starting and you don't know exactly what's going to happen, never treat anything that you're doing as a failure. Just because it doesn't look the way you intended for it to look doesn't mean that it's a failure. It means that you have something, another tool for your tool chest for the future. And truly, that's not just an empty accolade. That is the way that you grow. I also like to paint things more than once. The second time I paint it, I'm going to lose some things that I liked from the first painting, but hopefully at least the essentials won't be lost, and the things that I wanted to improve on will be improved on because I'll have a better plan. It's funny how everything in watercolor seems to come down to your plan and your willingness to take chances. So now I'm going to redo some of these lines, but now because I'm working wet into wet, they're really bleeding. So the really important thing too is that I see this interesting shadow being cast by her body onto the floor. And a really dark one, I'll have to darken this up, but some very, very light shadows. Let me tilt the paper to the side so that I can draw some of these a little bit more deliberately. Ugh, I'm gonna have to wait till it dries. Let me just add some purples to these shadows while they're here. There we go. And really focus on getting what you want of this line done. Because even though the whole texture of the floor might not be done, if this is done, then I can remove that tape, like I can remove this tape. And then it's less visually distracting. I'll be able to make my adjustments a little bit more easily because the tape isn't in the way. See how the purple helps to make things just that much more interesting. So you don't just have a brown mixed up. I haven't even touched the brown. I know it looks brown, but this is all reds and purples and just kind of mixtures of colors on the paper doing what it will. So I'm about the place where I need to stop. I just want to lift out a few thin lines. And see how I can just let that brush skip some skinny lines over for me. Be really careful when you're doing work like this because it's all going to show up. It's hard to hide if you make a mistake, in other words. So now with the paper, this level of wetness, I can cut out some details and bring out some whites again on this side. There's a really faint line in the floor. Right about there. And then this shadow that she's casting on the floor, Shouldn't just stop. It needs to get lighter and lighter though as it goes away from the source. Shadows always get lighter as they move away from the source. I want a bit more peach color in there. And I want it to be very bright, but the window is the brightest thing of all, which means that I can't let it be equally bright as the window. So I need to brush across with at least a tiny bit of color, just like this. So it's still going to look like a reflection, but it's not going to look as bright as a window. Now you just have to sort of work it back and forth until you have something interesting happening on the page that doesn't fight the look that you're going for. Whether or not you capture it in the first pass, you probably won't, because watercolor is a lot about patience. You have to wait for the paper to get to the right moisture level again. But if you can keep every level interesting, at least with some cool textures and techniques happening, then it's going to be a lot more easy to layer on just a bit more color, make it pop, but not have to put more and more work into it at every stage. Because it will be interesting at least the whole way through. So maybe I'll add more details to the shadows after it's had a chance to dry. But at least the shadows don't look bad right now. I'm going to touch in with a little bit of red, and it went a bit over the top here, so I'm going to wash it out. Keep that red tint, but okay. I'm going to let this dry, and as I say, we might need to go back in with more details after this first pass is dried. Okay, I'm liking the way it looks. I think I need a few more darks. Let's go ahead and take off the tape. See how we did? I think we need a little bit more dark on the division between the floor and the wall as well. So let's get started there. Just a little bit. Now if you need to, make sure that you tip your board so that you can work the most efficiently. I want to turn it upside down so that the line that I make is very straight and in control. The dark portion is on the upside. And it's a little bit irregular So I'm going to keep it a bit irregular and kind of let my brush do some skipping. Turn it back upside right. That looks better. Then I think in the floor, darken up those corners a little bit more. And add a few more details here and there. Just be careful not to overdo it. Details are tricky. They make the painting, but they can also break the painting. Too many details and it'll actually turn from realistic to just overworked. So to help ensure that they're not too overdone, I'm going to blot with a paper towel and rub some of those lines out as I go. I'm going to do a little bit more work on that later. Let's go over to the skin tone. For the skin tone, in this case, I'm going to use a round brush. Mix up a base tone of the Winsor Red and Winsor Yellow. Have a little blue on hand to make it go a little bit more purple. And then it's so small that I'm really going to try and get everything down in one large piece. And the skin is very dark because she's backlit. I don't want the color to be too saturated, so I'll go back with a wet brush and touch into a few places. And then carefully paint her fingers. Going up the arm, you can dip in from the neck to get a little bit more color saturation without having to go back to your palette. And the shadows on this arm are really important because the way the highlights fall show the way the arm is moving. So I'm just going to look at my reference material very closely and carefully put in these shadow shapes. Redraw anything that you need to before you start painting. I'm going to go back in with some purple. And just let my brush blob in some shadow shapes here and there. It's most effective to have a little shadow right next to the highlight line. So I'm going back and I'm going to darken up those areas a little bit more. and blend the tones in with a little bit of water if need be. Add some small delicate shadows to the face very carefully. And now that's all we can do on the flesh tone right now because it's too wet to hold any other detail. And I don't want to add the hair or the ballerina tutu yet because that would make them bleed. But I will show you how to add the wood, the frame behind. Now, matching the color is really important because you want it to look like the window is streaming the light through, and light and color choice go hand in hand. So for these panes here, I'm going to use a brush with just light, not saturated color, because the sun is coming right behind. And I'm just using a small brush and going carefully along. So I decided not to tape them because they're so small, and actually they don't look mechanically straight in the photo reference even. These are the same color. And then for these cross panes, they're mostly a little bit darker. Here I'll add this bottom one carefully. So I'm going to add the rest of those window panes, and I'm going to do a little bit more work on the floor. Nothing that you haven't seen, just to save time on the video though. I'm going to push ahead off camera, and I'll come back when the flesh tone is dry and we're ready to move on to the tutu. Okay, our dancer's coming along really well, so I'm going to remove the masking fluid on her foot, just rubbing that off with either your finger, since it's a small area, or a rubber cement eraser. This is really hard, compact eraser used for removing rubber cement off the backs of photos and things like that. Anyway, she's looking great, so I just need to add some detail to her clothes and her hair. Let me start in that hair. Now her hair looks really, really dark, but there's still color there, and hair is a great place to show light. The way the light hits the hair and the way you can kind of get an interesting pattern of colors and little shapes can add realism to your painting without very much effort. So I'm just going to quickly go in with a little kind of a basic brown color. And then before it dries, I'll drop in a reddish at the top. and then go really dark as well. Build up those contrasts. Don't be afraid of contrasts. In this piece, if you squint, one of the darkest places you can see is actually her hair, right down here and right here. So you can just let that dry, and I'll just take a clean wet brush then and blot out a little bit of more color at the top here and at the side here. Then I will let that area dry completely. Next, I'm going to paint her leotard. I'm using Payne's gray and some cobalt blue mixed together. Don't use black. Don't ever use black. It flattens your paints. It makes everything look flat and unrealistic, so that's no good. And don't use white because it makes everything go opaque, and you are painting in a transparent watercolor technique. So white paint will louse it all up. So I'm just carefully shaping this leotard, working carefully around her arms. And make sure that you work all the way up to the skin unless there is a light source. Otherwise it's not going to look like it's a tight-fitting clothing. So I work carefully around the skin, and that helps to define her arm and the shape of her body more. And then here you have these really important shadows and folds on the clothing. They're really important because they help to show the direction that she's moving. So as you paint, they should be drawn, and I just want you to paint right up to the side of a wrinkle like this and leave a white cut mark. You'll be painting over that as you go along, but you can't get it back if you paint over it completely, even from the very beginning. So don't just fill it all in black like a coloring book. You need to have some room for the folds and some highlights on this black material. So see how I'm just painting these shapes. And I want to get the whole thing done in one big piece before it has a chance to dry. That's a benefit of painting small, especially when you're a beginner, because it's more easy, a lot more easy, to do these large shapes without stopping. And that way you can get those smooth, even colors that are so realistic. Now as I come closer to the light, I'm going to change the color and wash it out a little bit with your brush not too wet, otherwise it will bleed. But then I'm going to wash over those folds that I kept, and that way they're still there, but they're a lot softer. Just got some on her arm. That's no good. That's why you always have a damp brush and paper towels handy. So you dampen the area and then you blot it to lift that back out. As long as you catch it when it's wet, you should be okay. I'll re-darken up here. And then maybe to shake it up a little bit, I'm going to throw in some purple. You might not see purple on the piece, but one thing that you need to always remember, whether you're watercolor painting or painting in any medium, is that you can't have a color exist in only one spot. So it's much better if you can bring out some of the colors. Like there's purple down here in the floor and there's purple and blues in the walls. I want to bring those purples and blues into her as well, into her skin and into her tutu. This unifies the piece and it makes it kind of blend together and get rid of any problems that you might have with bullseyes in your composition as far as bullseyes of color. So you can't have anything stick out if it exists more place than one. Now we're just going to wash over and blend that, soften it. Take down the contrasts, but not completely. And then her tights are the same color. So I'm just going to work carefully to make sure that I don't mess up the shape of her leg. So it took a long time to draw. And make sure that you leave that highlight at the front. And then once I have it painted the first time, I like to go back and darken it, make it really nice and intense. But having that really intense color means that you have less water, and so it's easier to paint smooth areas if you have more water. That's why I get it wet and I paint kind of a base color first, and then I flood back into it with the second pass with a lot more dark, intense color. And don't forget the area around her ballet shoes, around the elastic band. Okay, now I need to let this dry and then come back and remove the masking fluid. I have finished, I've let her hair dry and I removed the masking fluid. So now we're going to do some more work on her face and put on her ballet shoes. So let me zoom in here a little bit. It's a really small area. So I'm going to first go in and finish up that hair with the dark accents. I'm just using a small round brush. I have some dark brown and some Payne's gray mixed up. And I'm just going to go around the areas that I left white. And by traveling around them, you bring them out again. And you add some interesting contrast, and you also polish up those small shapes. So you enable the viewer to see a lot more detail just by virtue of using more contrast. More contrast here by the side of the head too, I think. And especially here beside the chin. Now go really, really carefully in this area. You want to help to accent her face, and so you need to be really careful to make sure that you don't accent the wrong shape there. go out with a little bit lighter brown and soften some of those darks. Just make sure that you don't paint over everything. You need to keep some of those highlights, and you need to keep some of those light spots. So they might not be exactly highlights, but they're a lighter brown. And I'll soften beside this highlight here, just using a little bit of water on my brush to rub over this edge and make a better transition from the highlight into the rest of the skin tone. And then I'm going back over the face and I'm painting the shadow shapes of the face, just with my small brush. Now, when you're working really small like this, you're going to do a lot better to just be suggestive. Don't try to overpaint all of those little features. Just indicate them. And don't do that with line work, do it with shapes. So instead of painting the eye, paint the triangle of dark that falls as a shadow across the eye, and you'll have a lot better results. Do some work in the fingers while I'm waiting for that face to dry. I'm just darkening up one side of the fingers. And I'm not going to overpaint there because I really like the way that the light is already falling between the fingers, and so I have enough detail there. It's definitely coming across as fingers to the viewer, so I don't need any more than that. I'll grab a little bit larger brush and add some tone to her Ballet Slippers. Ballet Slippers are generally a gray pink. It's called ballet pink. It's kind of a grayed down pink, and I'm going to just try to paint what I see, but possibly bump it up a little bit more than what I see in the photograph, just because everything's having a tendency to go so low value. And that's okay, I just want there to be a little bit of color. So make sure that you see the color in the shaded area of the shoe, and then you can go back with after adding that first pass, and you can sharpen it up. These darks on the shoe are what allow you to see her foot as traveling back in space. So it's really important that you get them dark enough. Darken up the toe, darken up this toe, and the underside of the foot. I'll have to do that again after the paint has dried too. I'm going to soften up the shadow, or rather the highlight on the legs, the same way that I've done in the skirt and in the hair, just using a damp brush and painting over the top. See how I get this nice natural looking gradation from the dark to a lighter gray? It looks much more realistic this way. You don't want your paint to get too dark on your brush, so keep rinsing it out as you go. And you don't want to paint over all of those highlights. So if you do start to get too close to the white edge, blot it out, bring it back. Okay, that's looking better. I need to add a little bit more detail to her thumb because her hand looks like it's fallen into different pieces here. It's no longer attached. But I do like those strong lines of shadow and highlight. See how just a little bit of detail and a little bit of color here and there really goes far. And to add some shadow to the face, now that it's dried enough, I'm just going to mix up a little shadow fleshy color like purpley and reds. And just carefully add a bit of that shadow shape by the eye like I was talking about. And I can see an indication of this other eye on the other side of her nose. As soon as you've given enough of a sense of the expression on the face, stop. Because you're easily going to ruin the good that you've done. On small pieces like this, it's just so tricky to find the right point of stopping. An overworked face can look really scary and grotesque. You don't want that. So it's much better to err on the side of less detail. That might be enough right there. This is very difficult. Painting faces small like this is about the hardest thing you can do in watercolor because it's just so much a suggestion. You just need to suggest what's going on and back off. And I'm strengthening up these shadow shapes that combine her body right here. So there's muscles and bones that connect all of these parts of the face and the neck and the shoulder. And the light is falling on the entire form in one big piece. So it actually has a complicated shadow pattern that's still one big piece. So if you can learn to look for those pieces and paint them as one large piece, you're going to be a lot more satisfied with your results. A little bit more dark to her ballet slipper on the toe. We're really getting there. I feel like I'm about done. Make sure that there is a point of contact between the tip toe and the floor where the shadow is being cast. Okay, let me take this off screen one last time and do any final details after I've given my eye a chance to rest, and then I'll come back and show you the very finished product. Okay, after doing a little bit more fussing in the highlights and so forth, this is where I have wound up, and And there's always some things that you look back and you're like, maybe I could have done a little bit better here, maybe I could have done a little bit better there. But all in all, I think that it turned out a pretty successful piece. When you draw it yourself, make sure that you spend plenty of time getting the body right, because it's the body language that makes the whole piece. And of course, make sure that you protect your highlights. Don't forget to use tape for those really straight, precise lines of the floor and the window. And then don't be afraid of contrasts. All in all, it's a really, really simple piece that lends itself to some really great drama because of the strong contrasts developed by the light coming through the window. If you mess up the light the first time, definitely try it again, because learning how to capture light in your paintings is a key to making realistic and successful paintings. Not just in this one, but in anything that you want to paint. So it's definitely a lesson worth learning. The last step here is going to be to remove our tape. And once I've done that, I'll be able to see how the painting would look in a matte. And sometimes that changes things. It usually helps, but sometimes it helps you to see the, sometimes it helps the flaws to pop out, which still helps. Since you haven't taken it off the board yet, you can still work on those flaws. You can see how a nice clean white mat around is going to help those highlights to pop even more. So this is where I'm going to leave it. I hope that you've learned some things from watching me paint this dancer. I certainly hope that you try it on your own at home. And I also hope that you will join me in the future for another watercolor painting tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. So this is where I'm going to leave it. I hope that you've learned some things from watching me paint this dancer. I certainly hope that you try it at home, doing it multiple times if you need to. And of course, as always, thank you so much for watching.